The Frumkes Center for Writing and Culture at Hunter College presents 10 years of best-selling authors and great thinkers. Each week we broadcast new videos from our 10-year speaker archive online for free at our website. We look forward to seeing you again when it's safe. Please enjoy this presentation from the archives of the Frumkes Center for Writing and Culture at Hunter College.
I was going to introduce tonight's speaker, Joyce Carol Oates. Because I gave an extensive introduction last time, I say you've probably all heard it before, and I was just going to say, please welcome one of our most eminent, distinguished, brilliant writers. But I decided we have, even though they're not all here yet, north of 250 people have signed up for this event tonight, and a lot of students who may be filtering in as soon as their class gets out. So I'm going to once again give the same introduction and tell you, although you wouldn't be here if you didn't care about Joyce's work, I'm sure you do, but I'm going to give her the long introduction and tell you that tonight, by the way, she's going to be speaking about inspiration. And I think there is probably no more valuable talk you will encounter than having a great writer talk about inspiration and someone who has a poetic tongue like Joyce. So, Joyce Carol Oates once told me that she wrote 1 million words before she published anything. And if that statement had come from anyone else, it would sound incredulous. But coming from Joyce, who has penned at least 50 novels, 1,000 short stories, innumerable works of outstanding nonfiction, including literary biographies of Emily Dickinson, Dostoevsky, and James Joyce, memoirs, scholarly studies in the horror and gothic genres, books on boxing and the artist George Bellows, reviews, essays, and at least 8, I think probably 10 or a dozen volumes of poetry, all nonchalantly while she was mowing her lawn in Princeton, New Jersey, and doing her nails. It doesn't sound strange at all. What does sound curious and peculiar is that Joyce, who is a literary force of nature, keeps getting overlooked for the Nobel Prize in Literature, despite her prodigious output and the seminal quality of her writings. In fact, the literati are shocked anew each year by the oversight and annually give voice to public lament. Nevertheless, Joyce deals with this snub, as she has with much of the pain and suffering in her life, stoically and with increased determination. In fact, Joyce once said, when she was being inducted into the Academy of American Achievement, "I'm drawn to failure. I feel that I'm contending with it constantly in my own life." But there is the bright side of Joyce's life, too. Joyce did distinguish herself early by writing stories when she was 14 and soon after actually winning a college short story contest when she was 19. She then graduated from Syracuse University, valedictorian of her class, and took a master's degree from the University of Wisconsin. She won the National Book Award for her novel Them in 1970 and garnered dozens of other literary prizes for lifetime achievement, including the National Humanities Medal, the highest civilian honor for the arts, the National Book Critics Circle Award for lifetime achievement, the Commonwealth Award for distinguished achievement, etc., etc. Joyce is currently the Roger S. Berlin Distinguished Professor of Humanities at Princeton University, where she continues to pursue what she has always loved best, writing and teaching. Gives me great pleasure, ladies and gentlemen, to introduce the Hunter College Writing Center's Gerda Whitney Vanderbilt Connor guest writer for this year, and one of, I'm guessing I said America's greatest talents, but we won't know until I turn the page, and one of America's greatest writers, Joyce Carol Oates. Joyce?
Thank you for that extraordinary introduction. I don't actually do my lawn. I don't actually mow the lawn in Princeton. And I don't spend much time doing my nails. But it's a very lovely and generous introduction. I was here about a month ago and had such a great time. I met some very interesting people, and I was so impressed with the quality of the questions that people ask. I felt it was a really provocative and stimulating evening. So I hope that I'll give my little talk on inspiration and obsession, if there's any difference between the two. I started writing about inspiration, and I sort of ended up writing about obsession, and the two really flow together. So this is a very informal talk, and I hope that some of you, or even all of you, will have something to add to it, some volunteer, some ideas, or some experiences of your own that have to do with inspiration, and the essential excitement and mystery of a new idea that can come over us very suddenly. I'm going to be talking about really extraordinary people, and then I'll talk a little bit about myself. Inspiration is an elusive term. We all want to be inspired if the consequences are something original and worthwhile. We'd even consent to be haunted and obsessed if the consequence was significant. I know I would. What does it mean to be captivated by an image, a phrase, a mood, an emotion? This is a quote, a beautiful quotation from Wittgenstein, Ludwig Wittgenstein, Philosophical Investigations. I'm sure you all know Wittgenstein's work very intimately. A picture held us captive, and we could not get outside it, for it lay in our language, and language seemed to repeat it to us inexorably. Wittgenstein had written about the limits of language, and I've often wondered, can one have an experience like a dream or a psychic experience for which there's no language? I guess music aspires to that, and sometimes beautiful images. You have a dream that's extraordinary, and you can't really express it in words. But for some people, the picture or the image or the language holds them captive. And can you get free of that? Most serious and productive artists are haunted by the material. This is the galvanizing force of their creativity and their motivation. It's not and cannot be fully conscious or volitional, this haunting, something that happens to us as if from without. I'm thinking of Emily Dickinson's chilling exclamation. Quote, this is just two beautiful lines. To whom the mornings stand for nights, what must the midnights be? Most of the Dickinson poems we revere and have lodged deeply into us are beautifully articulated and delicately calibrated cries from the heart, formulations of unspeakable things at the point at which poetic inspiration has become something terror-filled. It occurs to me that maybe some of you have seen the movie Lincoln, which is playing now, and it's such a beautiful movie. Of course, it's set in the time of 1865. It seems like almost a mythical time to us now, at the very end of the Civil War and the end of slavery, which is this great curse on our nation. I mentioned it because Emily Dickinson was a contemporary. She was writing her best poetry in 1865. She lived in a very kind of encapsulated life in Amherst, Massachusetts. She lived in what she called her father's house. She, like everyone of her day, and particularly women of the time, was really surrounded by death and dying and illness. It was very, very common, extremely common for babies to die basically before they lived. Women died in childbirth. The idea of like just washing one's hands, to prevent infection was not known at the time. So women died in childbirth quite often. Emily Dickinson I think she was a virginal person. She did fall in love with someone, but she lived a life that we would call a spinster's life. She lived a life of extraordinary independence, but within her father's house. And much of what she writes about is dealing with death, but it's not a depressing sort of thing as we might think it. It's more like death is part of life, and she spent a lot of time, years, taking care of her elderly mother and then her elderly father. And so you might think that her poetry is obsessed with death, but really it's a very realistic kind of poetry. And I have one of her poems here. It's about 5 stanzas long. And you can see how she's very haunted by her subject matter. The first day's night had come, and grateful that a thing so terrible had been endured, I told my soul to sing. She said her strings were snapped, her bow to atoms blown, and so to mend her gave me work until another morn. And then a day as huge as yesterday's in pairs unrolled its horror in my face until it blocked my eyes. My brain begun to laugh. I mumbled like a fool. And though 'tis years ago that day, my brain keeps giggling still. And something's odd within, that person that I was, and this one, do not feel the same. Could it be madness, this? Sometimes I walk around the house sort of thinking to myself, could it be madness, this? She's a really beautiful poet, so the consummate poet of talking to oneself, and worrying about whether you're losing your mind. Poets don't, I think, have to worry about that because they project what they're thinking and put it into the poetry. Now, here's a very interesting, benign story about fate and 2 people meeting. H.M. had been a hugely successful young writer with his first 2 novels, quickly written in his early 20s following his seafaring adventures in the South Seas. Taipei, A Peep at Polynesian Life, 1846, and Omu, A Narrative of Adventures in the South Seas, 1847. Some of you probably know who this is, H.M. But now he is working on a 3rd seafaring novel, narrated in a similar storytelling voice, this time set on a New England whaling ship called the Pequod. Of course, this is Herman Melville. As a young man, he'd sail with a New Bedford whaler into the South Pacific, where after 18 months he'd jumped ship in a South Seas port. Going to sea for Melville was the beginning of my life. So he's working on this new novel, and as I said, he's already a best-selling novelist. He's very, very young. In his early 20s, he had 1 runaway bestsellers. And he's writing a 3rd novel in the same sort of breezy, conversational tone. When a book of short stories came into the house called Mosses from an Old Manse by Nathaniel Hawthorne, which had been published a few years before in 1846. So midway in writing his novel, he gets this book of short stories by someone named Hawthorne. He's 31 years old and younger than Hawthorne by 15 years. He read the book and was astonished and mesmerized by it. Quote, "It is that blackness in Hawthorne that so fixes and fascinates me." Melville put aside his novel and he wrote an essay on Hawthorne and his mosses. It's a famous essay in which he speculates, quote, "This great power of blackness in Hawthorne derives its force from its appeals to that Calvinistic sense of innate depravity and original sin, from whose visitations no deeply thinking mind is always and wholly free." I don't know how you all feel about innate depravity and original sin right now in 2012, but at this time, people seem to think that was very profound. Well, I guess if you look at the human race, innate depravity and original sin do make a lot of sense. Hawthorne's influence upon Melville was immediate and profound. What would have become just another seafaring adventure tale, and probably another bestseller, was transformed by the enchanted Melville into the intricately plotted and highly symbolic and poetic Moby Dick, the greatest of 19th century novels in America, and very likely the greatest American novel of all time. Melville was consumed by Hawthorne's prose style as well as Hawthorne's tragic vision, which he aligned with Shakespeare's. The result is a novel like none other that had ever been written, idiosyncratic, savagely brilliant, and original work of fiction that to many readers at the time, including educated readers, was unreadable. Now, I won't ask how many people in the audience have read Moby Dick, but it's a great novel. You just have to sort of plunge into it. But out of this purely accidental inspiration by an older contemporary, Herman Melville was driven to write Moby Dick, a great novel as we think of it today, and yet a crushing failure to the young author at the time. Reviews were wholly negative, even in the UK, in which Melville's early lightweight novels were overnight bestsellers. Melville continued to write but never regained his old optimism. Quote, "Dollars damn me," he said, he had not enough of them. By the time he died in 1891, all of his books were out of print and his name was forgotten. Henry Melville was the name in the New York Times obituary. Inspiration in this instance is a double-edged sword. What should we make of it? In the short run, what seems unmistakably like failure, in the longer run, what is obviously great success. Now, this is so interesting to me because by reading Hawthorne and being overwhelmed and influenced by him, Herman Melville wrote Moby Dick, which is a great novel. But having written that novel precociously, so to speak, he wrote it before there was an audience. It's like Kafka or a painter like Van Gogh. There's the audience, or Emily Dickinson, the audience is not really there yet. And so it was a failure at the time. I'm so interested, and maybe some of you know about the intense friendship between the older man, Nathaniel Hawthorne, and the younger, very lively and energetic man, Herman Melville. They had an extraordinary kinship that people don't really quite understand. I remember reading about Mrs. Melville, and I think one of her sisters. They were sort of skulking outside a room where Melville was in the room with Hawthorne. Like, they were talking all night long. They were talking very intensely, these two, by candlelight. It sounds very romantic. And the women have their ears to the door trying to hear what the men are saying. I always wanted to write about that, but I have not yet written about it. So if any of you feel inspired to write about that, what were the men talking about? Here's a smaller and very benign inspiration, the genesis of a remarkable short story by Katherine Mansfield. I'm sure you all know her work, titled Sun and Moon, written when Mansfield was 30 years old. This story is so beautiful. I teach it at Princeton to my students. It's only about 4 pages long. It's a very, very beautiful story. I think of it like ice melting. It's just so fluent and lyric and beautiful. Anyway, it was an astonishment that it came out of a dream. In her journal for February 10th, 1918, Mansfield wrote, quote, "I dreamed a short story last night, even down to its name, which was Sun and Moon. It was very light. I dreamed it all, about children. I got up at 6:30 and wrote a note or two because I knew it would fade. I didn't dream that I'd read it. No, I was in it. I was part of it, and it played around Invisible Me. But the hero is not more than 5. In my dream, I saw a supper table with the eyes of 5. It was awfully queer, especially a plate of half-melted ice cream." This story, for all its delicate filigree, is a heart-rending prophecy of the destruction of childhood innocence. The plate of half-melted ice cream is a little ice cream house that has melted away amid the debris of an adult's party. And if you don't know this story, I would recommend that you look it up. Katherine Mansfield's Sun and Moon, which came to her out of a dream. I've never had any experience like that. That's just amazing. And then the next little section is about one of the greatest novels and most famous novels ever written. The challenge was to write a ghost story. So Lord Byron had suggested to his friends traveling in Italy in the summer of 1816. And so Mary Wollstonecraft Godwin Shelley, Mary Shelley, 18 at the time, recounts this nightmare. "I saw the pale student of unhallowed arts kneeling beside the thing he had put together. I saw the hideous phantasm of a man stretched out, and then, on some working of some powerful engine, show signs of life. His success would terrify the artist. He would rush away, hoping this thing would subside into dead matter. He sleeps, but he's awakened. He opens his eyes. Behold, the horrid thing stands at his bedside, opening his curtains." This is her dream. It doesn't seem to be a sense here that the allegorical horror story is written or imagined into being by the author. She's the passive observer. The vision seems to come to her from a source, not herself. Yet it can't have been an accident that Frankenstein, this novel is Frankenstein, telling of a monstrous birth, was written by a young unmarried pregnant woman who'd had 2 babies with her mercurial and unpredictable poet-lover, Percy Shelley, one of whom had died. The love story of Mary Shelley and Percy Shelley is quite something. And Lord Byron, the summer when all of them were together, was quite amazing. They were all, except for Byron, they were just teenagers. Following this dream, Mary Shelley had her subject. She spoke of being possessed by it. Initially, she thought that Frankenstein would be a short story. Eventually became a curious, heavily Miltonic-inspired allegorical novel. I'm sure that all of you read it and you probably have looked at it. It's very hard to read by our contemporary standards. It's very didactic and turgid, and it was exciting at the time. It was very considered kind of immoral novel at the time. It was rejected by both Shelley's and Byron's publishers because it was written by a woman. Obviously, when Mary Shelley sent us out with her name on it, it was already a couple strikes against it. But it was finally published anonymously in 1818 when Mary Shelley was 21. Since then, it has not been out of print ever and might be considered the most extraordinary novel ever written by an 18, 19-year-old enthralled to a brilliant but wholly unreliable romantic poet. Along with the Bronte sisters' wonderful novels, Charlotte Bronte's Jane Eyre and Emily Bronte's Wuthering Heights, Mary Shelley's Frankenstein is one of those great first novels written by young women, intensely romantic. Today, Frankenstein is not identified as the doctor of the creator of the monster, but the monster himself, the hideous phantasm. And Mary Shelley's horrific creation has been detached from her, prevailing in our culture as an iconic figure, seemingly self-generated, one of the most potent symbols of humankind's predilection for self-destruction, as compelling in 2012 as it was in 1818. Now, you've really been very successful, like the creator of Dracula, when your creation is in the culture and nobody remembers you anymore. It was Bram Stoker who created Dracula, and Mary Shelley created Frankenstein. More usually, inspiration is highly personal. James Joyce was captivated by the city of Dublin, Ireland. In his succession of brilliantly imagined fictions, short and long, accessible and extravagantly obscure, he commemorated the city as it existed in the early years of the 20th century more vividly than any photographs or documentaries. Joyce said, apropos Ulysses, the favorite novel of many a writer, that for all its complexity and the Odyssean grid beneath, it was a means of, quote, capturing the speech of my father and my father's friends. This is so beautifully and succinctly put. Much of literature is a way of assuaging homesickness, the yearning of the exiled child for his homeland and his past, the bittersweet melancholy of capturing the past, as Joyce's contemporary Marcel Proust also did, by a fantastically intense immersion in memory, this commemoration. You probably also, some of you know or have read Proust's Remembrance of Things Past, which is an evocation of the child Proust's intensely sensuous memories, very detailed, very dreamlike and mesmerizing. The early surrealists considered the world a vast forest of signs to be interpreted by the individual artist. Beneath its apparent disorder, the visual world contains messages and symbols. Like a dream, is the world a collective dream? The surrealist photographer Man Ray wandered the streets of Paris with his camera, anticipating nothing but leaving himself open to chance. The most striking surrealist images were at the start seemingly ordinary, but made strange by being decontextualized, beautiful as the chance encounter of a sewing machine and an umbrella on a dissection table. There is something thrilling about the surrealist adventure, moving out into the world to discover what awaits us, a found image, a found poem. For the writer, inspiration isn't a challenge, the execution is a challenge. So particularly if you're a visual artist, going out into the world and looking for unexpected things and with your camera is very much an adventure. It's quite different from being the sort of intensely inward poet of the confessional poets like Sylvia Plath and Robert Lowell and Anne Sexton, people who write about themselves. There's a kind of art where you actually go out into the world and look at other people. And I have lots of different examples. I'll just end this part of my little talk of discussing Joseph Heller's strange account of the genesis of Catch-22. Some of you may be aware of this. Now, Joseph Heller is a very eccentric person. I've only met him a few times, and his way of writing is so different from my own way of writing. It's just like we're completely different species of human being. Anyway, he had been in the Army, he had his experience in World War II, but he didn't plan this novel. But out of nowhere, Joseph Heller said, the opening line of the novel came to him, quote, "It was love at first sight." And that just came into his head. It was love at first sight. The first time X saw the chaplain, he fell madly in love with him. These words simply came to Heller for no reason and could not be explained. Yet within 90 minutes, as Heller claimed, he worked out the novel of Catch-22 in his mind. Its unique tone, its tricky form, its admixture of black humor and horror, and many of the distinctive characters. Are you all hearing that, or is that just inside my head? It's a sort of inspiration, I guess, that I can't deal with. No. Then the genesis for Something Happened, his next novel, is equally strange. This sentence came to him, quote, "In the office in which I work, there are 4 people of whom I am afraid. Each of these 4 people is afraid of 5 people." This is the bizarre beginning of a novel that would absorb Heller for many, many years. Again, he claims to have known within an hour the beginning, middle, and ending of the novel and its predominant tone, which was anxiety. So Heller took his inspiration from stray lines that came to him, and they were the first lines of his novel, and then he worked on that and developed that, which, as I said, is very, very peculiar. I'll talk a little bit about some inspirations of my own, and then, as I said, I hope some people will have some questions or something to add. Some years ago, I think this is about 1998, I was looking at a book, and so I turned the page, and there was a photograph of a girl. She was about 17 years old, 16 years old. She was Norma Jean Baker, and she would become Marilyn Monroe. But at this time, she was a high school girl. She had brunette hair. She was a pretty girl, but not glamorous. And she did not look like Marilyn Monroe, the Marilyn Monroe that we know. So I saw this picture, and I just felt overwhelmed with like recognition. And I felt that I really liked her, that she was like a high school girl I might have gone to school with in upstate New York, like in the 1950s, sort of a long time ago. And she also reminded me a little of my mother. It was just like a world that is gone from my life now of somewhat poor people living in a small town. And in Norma Jean Baker's case, she didn't have a father. She had a mother who was schizophrenic and couldn't really take care of her. And the mother didn't like to touch her. It's sort of hard to be a child if you have a mother who doesn't like to hold you. It's kind of sad. So I did a little research into the young Norma Jean Baker, and I was so thrilled and excited. I thought that I would write a very original novel, about 120 pages long, and it would be about the young Norma Jean Baker. And it would take her from her childhood to her teenage years up to the point where she's been a model, and she's a starlet at in Hollywood at a movie company, and she is going to be groomed to take the place of Betty Grable, who is perceived as being too old. Now, I don't want to even think about how old Betty Grable was at that point, or Doris Day, or whoever it was. She was taking the place, I guess it was Betty Grable, who was the blonde. And so they brought in this young starlet who hadn't really made very many movies, and she just had bit parts. And they worked out a name for her, and that name would be Marilyn Monroe. And my novel was going to end with the name Marilyn Monroe. Like that was, the princess is, that's like Cinderella, like the beggar maid gets her name, she becomes a princess, and I was going to end the novel at that point, because I figured that the reader then would know how complex her life was, and how tragic her life was as she moves on from there. So I got to that point, it was probably about 300 pages rather than 120. And then I realized that I had to keep on going, that the great adventure of Norma Jean Baker's life was following this giving her name. And so I did research looking at all her movies that were available. And I saw the sort of gestation and development of, I'm so distracted by all that noise, I'm sorry. Maybe they'll go out, and I'll just wait a second, maybe they'll stop. Well, anyway, I had such an experience because of having seen that photograph. So I took out all the movies, the tapes, and videos that I could, and saw Marilyn Monroe's career, and spent really weeks and months sort of researching that. And I saw that she was really under-evaluated and underrated, and she was really a great actress. And she had never been properly rewarded. She never won an Oscar. She was always considered a B-movie actress, sort of second level. So I felt that I wanted to write about somebody who was both like my own mother and completely unlike, somebody I might have gone to school with and somebody I would never have met in a million years. So it was a strange kind of combination of a certain kind of lower working class American from California, from Southern California, who somehow became the most famous female actor and sort of a sex object in the world, and she was like the sexiest female ever published in Playboy. There's some commemoration like that, and I thought that it's so ironic because this person is also a person who committed suicide, probably when she was 36, or she was so depressed that she took many sedatives because she couldn't sleep, and she died in a way as a kind of suicide. And what that meant, that she was this Playboy icon. So that's probably the most extreme example of an inspiration in my own life, because if I hadn't looked at that picture, I would have never written my novel Blonde, that took a couple of years and became extremely complicated, and it's like a novel in which Marilyn Monroe is looking back on her own life, and her voiceover is a narration of from beyond the grave. She dies on the last page, and then the novel is her telling her story. Let me pause for a minute. Does anybody have any questions or any things to add to this about inspiration?
We can open it to questions now, Joyce?
Yeah, and I can talk about other things too, but...
Hold on just a moment. Oh, go ahead.
No, I was going to say the audience may have
Yeah.
excited.
No. What I was going to say is we don't have a mic like we usually do upstairs, so I will ask you to project if you can, and if you can't, my assistant Bridget Bolahanas will come around and try and amplify what you say. Yes. Now, who has a question for Joyce? This young lady here.
Not really a question. I think what you did with Marilyn Monroe was just mind-blowing. I love Marilyn Monroe. So what you did is definitely best.
This lady loved what Joyce did with Marilyn Monroe.
Let me just say, I fell in love with her too. I have to say, when I saw the iconic Marilyn Monroe, the posters and all that, I didn't feel any identification, the platinum blonde and the dresses and all that. But when I went back and saw her life and how she struggled and how hard she worked, she took classes, she took dancing lessons when she was already famous, I had such respect for her. Nobody talks about her as a career woman. She was a working woman. She was working. She wasn't like Ava Gardner or Elizabeth Taylor, who were kind of on a higher level. She was right in there like the proletariat, and I felt the same way. My heart went out to her. Thank you.
Who else would like to ask Joyce a question? Over here?
Speaking about inspiration and characters, do you like to find your characters in real life, or you like to imagine them?
Do you like to go ahead.
Do I find characters in real life or I'll imagine them? I think it's probably a composite, because when I wrote about Norma Jean Baker, obviously I had to imagine her language and how she dealt with her mother and what her mother said to her, and she had a love affair with John F. Kennedy. I had to imagine a lot of those things. I didn't invent much of her life, but I had to imagine it. So it's a kind of combination of imagination. But I mentioned in my talk about all these people like James Joyce and Marcel Proust, who wrote about themselves. They wrote almost exclusively about their own experience. And Hemingway did a lot of that too. And they're great writers. They're absolutely great writers. So you can have a subject that is yourself, and you don't have to make up much if you have a lot to say and you connect with other people. Like the memoir is a very strong genre today. And the idea of a memoir is that you're talking to people without any intermediary. You're sort of talking honestly. I think people really relate to that.
Yes.
If you're writing about someone you knew well, and a very famous person, do you find it a conflict to protect them and yet be truthful about the subject?
If Joyce is writing about a very famous person, does she feel a conflict between the need to protect that person and to tell the truth about them?
Well, if I was writing about Lewis, I would protect you by not putting in your nice buckle.
Thank you.
There are little things that you can do, I don't write about people that I'm really close to, and I don't really write much about myself, I have to say. I get kind of excited about writing about archetypal situations that are in the culture. For instance, I have a novel coming out in January called Daddy Love, and it's about a boy of 4 or 5. He's kidnapped by a sex offender. I mean, he's kidnapped by this perverted person who takes him away for about 6 or 7 years, and I deal with the family and then the boy and the predator. And that is something that has happened in our culture. It's actually happened quite a few times. And I didn't do research into any actual people, but I know that the outline of it is something that's in our culture. And how do you deal, if you're the family, you've lost a child, but you never give up. They never give up expecting the child to be returned to them. They never give up, and they think about the child every minute, basically. And then the child is returned to them at the end. But years have gone by, and so it's a different person, and the experience is very profound. And so in writing about that, I'm writing about something that's in the culture, but I'm not writing about the actual people. I'm inventing people, and there's a certain tenderness, for instance, in imagining how a mother would feel and how the parents never give up. To me, that was the nobility of ordinary life, which I saw in my own family, my parents and my grandparents. I saw that they were, and you probably feel the same way about older people in your family, that they were really noble people, that they were heroic and stoic and uncomplaining in a way that contemporary people might not be.
We'll take 2 more questions, this lady here and the lady in back of her. And then Joyce will go over and be willing to inscribe books for you at the table in the back, and we have refreshments for you.
I thought
my novel, We Were the Mulvaneys. Well, I could talk about how I was inspired for that. I don't know if anybody's read it. It's the novel of mine that more people have read than other novels because it was an Oprah book club selection. So for a while, for a short while, when I was like walking in an airport, people would come up to me. I thought, I'm a literary writer. I'm not used to anybody knowing me because I had been on television on Oprah's wonderful show. I'm really sorry that she discontinued that. I think that was a mistake. But that particular novel was about a girl experiences what we would call date rape, but it was 1976. There wasn't any word for it. And there weren't any sex crimes units in most police departments. So if you were raped or sexually molested and you're a young girl, you would probably not tell anybody about it. You wouldn't really want to go to the police because a male police officer would be questioning you and it would be so awful. And many girls and women, even now, don't report sexual crimes. They're just so traumatized and so humiliated and they feel guilty and ashamed. They don't want to go through the whole idea of a trial. So that's what the novel is about. A girl who doesn't want to make charges, she doesn't want a trial. She's a very Christian girl. She wants to somehow be able to forgive her rapist, and then her family kind of falls apart as a consequence. I got the idea for that from something that had happened when I was in high school. Something had happened to a friend of mine, but it was never talked about. It was never, ever talked about. But yet some boys would joke about it. So that's in the novel, too. You sort of hear some coarse jokes that boys would make, but nobody ever talked about it. It was like it just didn't happen. And I know that my friend was devastated by it. And to this day, we're still friendly, though we don't see each other, but we do email. To this day, I would never be able to say anything, but I'm sure she read my novel, in which a very nice girl has something awful happen to her. Then also for that novel, because the family falls apart, I got the idea of the father who becomes irrational, an older father from King Lear, who is the quintessential older tyrannical father. My own father had been a very loving man, but then when he got to be in his 80s and he had illnesses, his personality started changing, and he wasn't quite as loving as he had been. And I remember being stricken to the heart. I remember being so hurt and so wounded. I was a completely adult woman. I mean, I shouldn't have been like a child. I felt like a girl, like 10 years old. I thought my father doesn't love me. And I just felt so bad about that. So all that's in the novel, where the girl thinks that her father doesn't love her because this thing has happened to her. So it's kind of complicated inspiration.
All right, the lady there. Bridget, can you come and amplify for her?
No, I haven't started. First of all, I want to thank you for your writing. You meant so much to me, and I feel like I know you. I'll never forget your short story about Mary Jo Kopechne. And it was your empathy and your ability to express the inexpressible, the unbearable, just has always
Thank you.
And I don't know how do you do it? Is it just that you identify, is it like negative capability?
Well, I could talk about that a little bit. I have a short novel called Blackwater, and it's based on the Mary Jo Kopechne experience, but the girl isn't. She's actually quite different from the historical person. Senator Ted Kennedy, well, he was very young, he was only 34, had taken a girl out in his car. This is in Martha's Vineyard, and he was married and had children, and there was something going on between them probably. Anyway, he's driving, had been drinking. He's driving back along a narrow bridge over on Martha's Vineyard, and the car went off the bridge and went into this pond, and the car sank. He got out, he swam, and the girl Mary Jo Capetny in real life, and also and the girl in my novel, was trapped in the car. And there was a lot of journalism about it. She was sort of trapped upside down in this car. She couldn't get out. He swam to shore, and he ran away. And he ran first to his lawyer. And time is going by. She actually, I think she suffocated. I think hours and hours and hours went by, and this was a terrible scandal. It was 1967. And all the focus was on the Kennedy, the scandal, his picture, and all that. And I thought, what about that girl? And I was haunted by the nightmare of what it would be like to be in the car. First, you would expect he'd be coming back to get you. He'll be back like in 5 minutes, or he'll call the police, and an ambulance will come and get me. And she was able to breathe. There was some oxygen, there was some air in the car. She would have had a reason plausible to expect that he would save her. I mean, anybody would have done that, except he didn't. And so I wanted to write about the nightmare that she, like a tragedy, like like Shakespeare, you know, that this girl is suffering in a way that's commensurate with actual tragedy. And then I go back, as she's drowning, her life sort of flashes past her, and each chapter is very short, like a ballad, and each line of each end of each chapter is, and the black water filled her lungs, and she died. And then it starts another little chapter. So it was like the structure of music, of a ballad, and then finally at the very end, she sort of accepts the fact that he's not coming back, and she becomes a person who's a greater person than he is because of her acceptance. And then the novel ends at that point. Definitely that was completely inspired by something that happened historically. Yes, thank you.
I hope you were all inspired by this brilliant lady's words. She is a unique literary figure. And Joyce will join us over there, and she'll be there if you would like to purchase a book, and she will inscribe it for you. If not, join us for coffee and cakes or coffee or whatever, and do come visit us again. Thank you for coming tonight.